He lifted my hair, allowing his fingers to graze my neck. At first, his touch was gentle, his fingers working through the knots with a tenderness that made my heart ache for the things missing from my life. But then, his hands lingered, moving slowly, deliberately, each caress too intimate for just a massage. I should have stopped him. I should have said something when I felt the warmth of his breath on my neck, heard the slight shift in his breathing, but I didn't. I was craving touch, starving for any sign that I was still desired. They say the stillness of the forest holds many secrets, and mine began in a remote cabin, a place where silence speaks louder than words and the lines between love, loneliness, and longing blur in ways you never expect. I never imagined that a simple getaway would lead me to a moment I couldn't undo, a moment that would stay with me like an indelible mark, never fading, just as I crossed the threshold into my 40s. I am a lonely woman, lost in my own full family. My husband, Dominic, is a renowned doctor in town, constantly absorbed in his work, leaving me to care for our children alone. Arlo, my eldest son, has been my only source of support, and his help has provided me with some comfort in the midst of my solitude. Yet, it's never enough. It's always just a quiet coexistence, no sparks, no excitement. I've started to wonder if I'm even seen by him anymore. I still remember the early days of our marriage, how Dominic would surprise me with handwritten notes hidden in my bag or whisk me away on weekend trips filled with laughter and passion. Those memories now feel like relics of another life, buried under the weight of responsibility and neglect. I tried, oh how I tried, to reignite what we once had. Candlelit dinners, new lingerie, heartfelt conversations, but all I got in return were polite nods, distracted responses. It wasn't enough. I've stopped hoping for change, not because I no longer love him, but because I no longer feel anything from him. The love I once felt has faded into the background, a dim memory drowning in the neglect and silence. The fire that once burned brightly between us has now turned to ashes. Loneliness and heartbreak had quietly and steadily led me down a path I never thought I'd find myself on, one I feared would destroy everything I had tried so hard to build. It felt like a dream gone wrong, a nightmare creeping into the quiet spaces of my home. A place where, despite the surface of a seemingly perfect family, I was drowning in emptiness, lost in the silence between us. It all began during our winter vacation, a time I thought I could use to salvage the connection between Dominic and me. I had been preparing for this weekend for weeks, desperately holding on to the hope that it might be the spark we needed to reignite what had long since faded. I thought if we could just spend time together, away from the demands of everyday life, we could somehow find each other again. But it was during this very preparation that I began to feel the first stirrings of dread. Dominic, my husband, who once couldn't wait to surprise me with spontaneous weekends or thoughtful gestures, had become someone else. His attention was consumed by his work, by his endless list of patients and responsibilities, leaving me to take care of everything at home. When Dominic suggested I take Arlo to the family cabin for the weekend, I didn't hesitate to agree, but deep down, a cold knot formed in my stomach. "It'll be good for you, too," he said, his eyes not even lifting from his phone. "You haven't spent much time together lately." I forced a smile and nodded, pretending to believe in his words, but I knew the truth. He wasn't coming. He'd promised to join us later, but I could already feel the weight of his empty promises hanging in the air. He would find a reason to stay behind, another emergency at the clinic, another pressing matter that needed his attention. As the days passed, I tried to ignore the heavy feeling in my chest. I focused on getting ready for the trip, convincing myself that this was my chance to make things better, to reconnect with my son, Jason, to create new memories, to fill the void that had grown too large between me and Dominic. But with each passing moment, I felt a sense of inevitability settling in. Something inside me warned me that things wouldn't turn out the way I hoped. The drive to the cabin was silent, save for the occasional murmur from Jason, whose teenage indifference only seemed to deepen the distance between us. The closer we got to the cabin, the more I felt my anticipation transform into anxiety. The memories of the cabin, of the times Dominic and I had spent there in the early years of our marriage, felt like a different lifetime, a version of us that was no longer reachable. The thought of rekindling anything with him seemed almost impossible now. Once we arrived, I felt a wave of nostalgia mixed with a sharp pang of regret. The cabin, which had once been a sanctuary for us, felt cold and unfamiliar. I stood in the doorway, looking at the place that had once been full of laughter and warmth, now just a hollow shell of what it had been. Jason, ever the independent young man, moved efficiently, unloading the car without a word. He barely looked at me, his focus elsewhere, as I stood there, watching him, lost in my own thoughts, trying to make sense of what had happened to us. As the evening settled in, the fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth it offered didn't reach the coldness in my heart. Jason and I sat in near silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. I found myself watching him, trying to bridge the gap, but I didn't know how. There was so much I wanted to say, so many things I wished I could ask, but all that came out were empty words. When he offered to help me with my neck, a small, simple gesture, I didn't know how to refuse. I should have said no. I should have stopped him. But in that moment, I didn't. The loneliness I had been carrying for so long was overwhelming, and his touch, though innocent at first, was the only form of connection I had felt in what seemed like forever. But as his fingers moved with a tenderness that was almost too intimate for comfort, I felt something stir inside me. A spark, a surge of longing that I didn't expect. His touch lingered, and I found myself leaning into it, feeling a warmth spread through me that I hadn't felt in years. I knew it was wrong, so wrong. But in that moment, with everything inside me craving affection, I couldn't stop it. It was as if the lines between right and wrong, mother and son, had blurred, and I was caught in a moment I couldn't escape from. The fire crackled in the background, but all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, quickening, uneven. Was it a mistake? Yes. Could I undo it? No. And that was the part that terrified me the most. I had crossed a line, one I never thought I would, and the consequences of it loomed over me like a dark cloud I couldn't outrun. When we arrived at the cabin, I was struck by its modesty and rustic charm, far smaller and simpler than I had envisioned. Perhaps my imagination had embellished it, or I had been led to believe it would be more spacious. In reality, it was essentially one large room, filled with the scent of aged pine and lingering wood smoke. At the heart of the space was a large stone fireplace, dominating an entire wall, radiating a comforting warmth yet exuding an unfamiliarity that unsettled me. On one side of the room, a narrow opening led into a galley-style kitchen, cramped but organized. On the opposite side, a short hallway ended with 3 closed doors, inviting curiosity but tempered with apprehension. I opened each door in turn, my hope dimming with every discovery. The first revealed a bedroom with 2 beds, neither of which was a true double. Each was just wide enough for 2 people to share, though not without awkward proximity. The second door led to a small bathroom, clean but Spartan to the point of being austere. The final door opened into a tiny closet, sparsely filled with wooden hangers and a few neatly folded, worn blankets. Standing in the middle of that compact space, a mix of disappointment and unease washed over me. This wasn't the retreat I had envisioned, this wasn't the setting I imagined for a holiday meant to rekindle bonds and create memories. But as I looked around, the simplicity of the cabin began to exert a quiet pull on me, as though its unadorned nature demanded acceptance. Perhaps this was its charm, stripping away distractions, leaving us with nothing but the bare essentials and each other. Arlo, now 24, is no longer the little boy who used to crawl into my bed after a bad dream or beg me to watch his favorite cartoons with him. He's becoming a man, his shoulders broader, his voice deeper, carrying a quiet confidence that sometimes leaves me both proud and disoriented. It's as if time has shifted beneath my feet, and the child I once knew so intimately is slipping further away, replaced by someone both familiar and unknowable. Though he still lingers around me at times, the closeness we once shared, the heartfelt talks and moments of vulnerability, has faded into a comfortable yet distant coexistence. He rarely opens up about his life, and I often find myself missing the days when his words spilled out freely, unguarded and eager to connect. That day, I made a concerted effort to bridge the widening gap between us. I asked him about his friends, his studies, his hobbies, anything to draw him out. But his responses came in the form of short, clipped phrases, as though he was carefully rationing his words. The silences that followed were heavy, not hostile, but filled with an unspoken awareness of how far we'd drifted. I wanted to ask more, to push through his reserve and rediscover the boy who once confided in me without hesitation. Yet, as I watched him retreat into his quiet confidence, I couldn't help but feel the sting of loss, not just for the child he once was, but for the connection we once shared so easily. I never expected that an event that evening would make the relationship between Arlo and me more profound than ever. That night, we shared a warm dinner by the fireplace, the flickering flames adding an intimate glow to the atmosphere. A little wine eased our minds and encouraged us to open up, revealing thoughts we had long kept hidden. To my surprise, Arlo, through silent observation of my expressions, had discerned the turmoil that had been weighing on my heart. He gently took my hand, offering comfort. Yet, in that simple gesture, something unexpected stirred within me. My heart raced unusually fast as his eyes locked onto mine, steady, unwavering, and deeply penetrating. Time seemed to stand still. We lingered in that moment, letting the silence speak volumes. As the last pieces of wood in the fireplace began to dwindle, I stepped outside into the biting cold to fetch more logs. The icy air gnawed at my cheeks, and the weight of the logs pressed heavily against my arms as I carried them back inside. The frost seemed to seep into my very being, mirroring the loneliness embedded in every aching muscle. My neck throbbed painfully as I hauled the wood into the cabin, a tension I could feel in every strained fiber of my body. "Mom, you look like you're in pain." "Let me help," Arlo said, his voice deeper than I remembered, carrying a tone of maturity that was both surprising and unfamiliar. I glanced at him and realized that the boy I once knew had grown, standing before me now as a man. His outstretched hand exuded confidence and strength I hadn't noticed before. I nodded silently, unsure if my voice would betray me. Sitting down on the old, creaking bench, I turned my back to him and lifted my hair to expose my neck. His touch was gentle at first, his fingers working carefully to untangle the knots in my muscles. There was such tenderness in his movements that it struck a chord deep within me, a bittersweet ache for something I hadn't even realized was missing from my life. In that tiny cabin, surrounded by the wilderness and the biting cold, we were two solitary souls, bound together in a moment that would change everything. His hands lingered, moving with a deliberate slowness that bordered on agonizing. Every stroke, every slight pressure of his fingertips felt electric, sending tremors down my spine. The intimacy of his touch shattered the boundaries of propriety, each caress whispering promises that both thrilled and terrified me. I felt the warmth of his breath brush against the sensitive skin of my neck, and it was as if he ignited a flame deep within me. My pulse quickened, pounding loudly in my ears, drowning out reason. When his breathing shifted, deeper, more deliberate, it was like the air between us thickened, charged with something neither of us dared to name. I should have stopped him. I knew I should have. But I didn't. A desperate hunger clawed at me, an ache I had buried for far too long. His touch was more than a comfort, it was a revelation, pulling me into a storm of sensation and emotion. Shame warred with desire as heat unfurled in my chest, spreading like wildfire through my veins. When his fingers dipped lower, tracing the curve between my shoulder blades, it felt as though he was unearthing pieces of me I'd kept locked away. My body betrayed me, I arched slightly into his touch, each movement exposing my longing, my need. I hated how much I wanted this, wanted him, but the shame only sharpened the edge of my desire, making it impossible to resist the intoxicating pull of his hands on my skin. My heart pounded violently, each beat reverberating through my chest like a drum signaling an impending storm. His hand moved higher, the slow, deliberate motion igniting a wildfire beneath my skin. My breath hitched, trapped somewhere between my lungs and throat, a trembling barrier that refused to break. The question echoed in my mind, relentless and raw, was this what I truly wanted? Was this forbidden touch the answer to the aching void that had consumed me? The connection I had yearned for in my endless nights of isolation? The cabin around us seemed to shrink, its rugged walls fading into irrelevance as the air between us thickened with unspoken tension. In that fragile space, we were no longer just two people, we were forces, colliding in desperation, drawn together by a hunger neither of us dared to name. His touch carried a gravity that shattered the boundaries I had clung to, those once immovable lines dissolving with every stroke of his fingers. I felt my resolve slipping, my body betraying me in ways I could neither control nor deny. My muscles tensed, then softened, drawn to his warmth like a moth to a flame. The world outside ceased to exist, leaving only the two of us suspended in this charged moment. His fingertips grazed the sensitive space between my shoulder blades, and an involuntary shiver coursed through me, a signal of surrender. I leaned into him without realizing it, my body closing the distance as if it had been waiting for this all along. The heat of his presence seeped into me, igniting a need that was both terrifying and exhilarating. My skin burned where he touched, my pulse quickened where his breath teased the back of my neck, and my mind spiraled into chaos. Shame and desire collided, warring for dominance, yet I couldn't pull away. I felt myself unraveling, piece by piece, as though his hands held the power to expose every hidden vulnerability within me. My heart screamed for restraint, but my body, traitorous, relentless, arched toward him, craving more. This wasn't just touch, it was a tempest, a relentless tide eroding the walls I had built around myself. And as I surrendered to the storm, one undeniable truth emerged: I wasn't fighting him. I was fighting myself. That night, it wasn't the raging snowstorm outside the cabin that swept us away, it was the tempest within these very walls that consumed us. I couldn't name the fire that had burned so fiercely before extinguishing, leaving the room cold and hollow. Yet, I felt none of that chill. All I could feel was the crushing weight of guilt pressing against my chest, suffocating me under the burden of what had transpired. The memories of the night before clung to me, just beneath the surface, taunting me with their vividness. I tried to will them away, to bury them deep, but they hovered, a haunting echo I couldn't silence. I needed to act normal, to pretend that nothing had changed, even though everything inside me felt like it had shattered into unrecognizable pieces. By late afternoon, Dominic arrived, his cheerful voice cutting through the suffocating quiet of the cabin. "Looks like the storm didn't trap you too badly," he remarked as he stomped the snow from his boots at the threshold. I forced a smile, hoping it didn't betray the turmoil simmering within me. "The snow was heavy last night," I replied, my voice steady, though my heart raced beneath the thin veneer of calm. He leaned in and placed a quick kiss on my cheek, his familiar warmth and effortless charm wrapping around me like a well-practiced embrace. Yet it felt hollow, like a mask he wore, or maybe like the mask I now wore in return. I couldn't see through it, couldn't tell what lay beneath, and that uncertainty gnawed at me. "How's the cabin? You two managed to survive the storm?" Dominic asked, his tone light, his words laden with unspoken ease. I swallowed hard, the weight of his innocent question colliding with the truth I couldn't speak. "We managed," I said softly, averting my gaze as the storm that raged inside me threatened to spill over. That night, as Dominic slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling in the darkened room. The silence around me was almost suffocating, but my thoughts were louder than any storm. What had I done? What had I allowed to happen? And, more importantly, what was I supposed to do now? These questions circled endlessly in my mind, yet no answers came. I wasn't sure they ever would. Looking back, I wish I could tell myself it was just a fleeting mistake, an error born of vulnerability and the isolation of that cabin. I wish I could say we left it all behind when we walked out the door. But the truth is far more complicated and far heavier. That weekend altered everything. It left a mark, invisible to the world but etched deeply into the fabric of who I was. And from that moment on, I've been forced to live with the consequences. There's no manual for navigating this kind of labyrinth, no map to guide you when you've strayed into forbidden territory. I needed clarity, but all I had were questions and guilt that coiled tighter around me with every passing day. Have you ever felt trapped by your own desires? Have you ever looked at someone you shouldn't, let your mind linger where it had no right to be, and wondered if there was a way out? I searched the contours of my feelings, trying to untangle the strands of truth from the web of emotions that had ensnared me. Was it loneliness that had led me here, or something deeper, darker, an aching need to feel connected, to feel wanted? And yet, knowing the source of this turmoil didn't change the reality of it. It didn't undo the choices we had made or erase the weight they carried. I wondered if there were others like me, people who had wandered into this shadowed maze and found themselves lost. Would their stories offer me solace, or simply confirm the inevitability of this guilt? I found myself desperate for an answer, a sign that there was a way forward that didn't involve tearing everything apart. As the hours dragged on, the darkness outside began to wane, but the one inside me remained. Dominic stirred beside me, oblivious to the storm raging within me. I envied that peace, that innocence, even as I knew it couldn't last. Morning would come, and with it, the weight of reality. We had stepped into this maze together, guided by desires we hadn't fully understood. Now, every step forward felt like it only led deeper into the shadows. I didn't know if there was an escape or if we were doomed to wander these twisting paths forever. But one thing was certain, this labyrinth wasn't just of our making, it was also of our choosing. And that, perhaps, was the hardest truth of all.